The wind cut across the high plains like a blade that knew his name, and Eli Calder felt it bite through wool and bone as Christmas morning climbed pale and slow over the ranch. The hook of the day caught him by the heart, because this was the hour he had promised himself he would never face again. Yet here he was, saddled and riding, breath smoking, hands stiff on the reins, carrying grief the way a man carries a rifle, careful and heavy, the world hushed with frost and memory, every fence post and drawer whispering that the past was awake and watching. He had not meant to leave before dawn, but sleep had turned against him, filling his head with the sound of hooves skidding on ice and the sharp snap of a rope gone wrong. So he rose and, dressed by lamplight, pulled on his hat and stepped into a morning that smelled of iron and pine smoke. The ranch lay still behind him, barns hunched and waiting, cattle quiet as if they knew where he was bound, the trail ahead pale with snow, leading him toward the place where joy once ended and time had never forgiven him. Eli rode with his eyes down, following the cut of the land more than the path, because the land remembered better than he did. It always led him true when his mind wandered. He thought of her laugh, bright as creek water in summer, and how it had faded on a winter road not far from the old cottonwood. The cross stood there now, simple and white, a scar made into a sign, and every Christmas sense had found him anywhere but there. Until this one, the widow waited at the bend where the willows thinned, her horse steady and her back straight, despite the cold. Mara Whitlock had lost her husband to the same country, though by a different cruelty, drought and debt instead of ice and chance. She tipped her hat when she saw him, eyes kind and steady. She did not speak at first, because she knew silence had weight and should not be rushed, and Eli felt something ease just by not being alone on that stretch of trail they rode together without hurry. The widow a half-length ahead, guiding him by instinct rather than word. She knew the shortcuts and the soft ground beneath the snow. She knew where sorrow pulled a man off course. Eli wondered how she could bear it, carrying her own loss and still making room for his. The answer came in the way she watched the horizon, not with fear but with patience, as if pain was a storm that passed when respected. The sun crept higher, turning the snow to a field of quiet fire, and Eli felt his chest tighten as the cottonwood came into view. Branches bare and reaching, the cross stood just beyond, white against the brown grass. He had built it with his own hands, hammer blows ringing like accusations. He had not returned since the ground thawed that year, yet here the widow guided him true, reining in and letting him ride the last yards alone, a gift of space that felt like mercy. He dismounted slow, boots sinking, breath loud in his ears. The cross was smaller than his memory and heavier than his dreams, names carved careful, dates that still felt wrong. Eli touched the wood and felt the cold bite back. He spoke her name aloud, and the land listened. The widow waited a distance away, head bowed, giving him the dignity of grief without spectacle. The wind eased as if the plains themselves leaned closer when he turned back. Eyes wet and heart raw, Mara met his gaze and nodded, not as a guide finished with a task, but as a fellow traveler who knew the road did not end here. The rancher felt a change he could not name, a loosening, a breath taken after a long hold. Christmas morning had led him to the cross, but it was the widow who had shown him how to stand there, and in that quiet, the promise of the day began to stir. The widow did not hurry him away from the cross. Instead, she sat her horse and let the morning finish saying what it needed to say, and when Eli finally turned back toward the trail, she fell in beside him without a word. They rode slow, the kind of slow that lets thoughts stretch out and show their true shape. And as the ranch buildings came back into view, through the thin blue haze of cold, Eli felt something he had not felt in years, the urge to speak honestly rather than carefully. So he told her things he had never told another soul. How the accident had begun with a simple argument about the road being slick, and him insisting they could make town before dark. How pride had felt like confidence right up until the moment it shattered. His words came rough and uneven, but the widow listened, like a woman who understood that confession was not weakness but weather, something that passed through and left the air clearer, if endured. Mara answered him then, her voice low and steady, telling him about her husband Thomas, a good man who loved the land too fiercely to ever leave it, how the drought had taken their grass, and the bank had taken their hope, and how one morning he rode out to check a fence and never rode back, leaving her with silence that rang louder than any shout. She spoke of nights when the house felt too big, and mornings when it felt too small, of learning to run a spread alone while neighbors whispered pity she neither wanted nor needed. Eli heard in her words a map of survival drawn with patience and grit, and he realized she had not guided him to the cross by chance. She had done it because she knew that some places must be faced before a man can move again, and that Christmas was not only a day for joy, but for reckoning. They reached the house and unsaddled in the brittle cold, breath rising like smoke signals, and Mara accepted his invitation to warm up inside. The kitchen still smelled faintly of pine from the boughs he had hung weeks earlier and forgotten. Coffee steamed between them as the light crept across the floor, and conversation wandered from lost to land, from cattle prices to the stubbornness of winter storms. Yet beneath it all ran a deeper current, an understanding that neither pushed nor pulled, just held steady. Eli noticed how the widow carried herself, not bent by grief but shaped by it, like wood worn smooth by years of weather, and he felt a stirring of respect that was not yet hope but pointed in that direction. As the morning grew older, neighbors began to arrive with cautious knocks and bundled laughter, bringing pies and tins and the small kindnesses ranch folk offer without ceremony, and Mara moved among them easily, offering help, washing cups, making room. She fit the house as if it had been waiting for her all along. Eli watched from the doorway, struck by the simple fact that the walls felt warmer with another presence inside, not because she filled the space, but because she understood it. When children laughed and boots stamped snow from the porch, he felt the ache in his chest ease just a fraction, and for the first time since the accident, Christmas did not feel like an accusation, but like a question, asking him whether he was willing to live the answer. After the visitors drifted away and the sun tipped west, Eli and Mara walked the fence line together. The land stretched wide and quiet, a pale sky pressing low. He showed her the pasture he planned to rest, and the creek that never quite froze, and she pointed out where drift snow would pile and how the wind would shift come January. Their talk turned practical, yet every shared observation felt like a stitch drawing something torn back together. Eli realized he trusted her judgment without effort, that her presence steadied him the way the land always had, and he wondered when that had begun, whether it was this morning or long before, perhaps the first time she had met his eyes and not looked away from the pain. She saw there. They stopped at the rise overlooking the valley, and Mara asked him what he wanted now, not what he owed the past or feared from the future, but what he truly wanted. The question hit him harder than any memory. He stood quiet, hat in hand, watching light spill across the snow, and answered slowly that he wanted the ranch to thrive without swallowing him whole, that he wanted to remember his wife without drowning in the remembering, and that he wanted mornings that did not feel like penance. Mara nodded, as if these were reasonable things to want, and in that simple acceptance he felt a door open somewhere deep inside, one he had kept barred by guilt and habit. As they walked back toward the house, dusk gathering, Eli felt the weight of the day settle into something solid and usable. Grief had not vanished, but it had changed shape, less a wound and more a scar, something that hurt in cold weather but did not bleed. He thought again of the cross beneath the cottonwood, standing quiet and sure, and understood that honoring the dead did not mean joining them. It meant carrying their love forward in a way that did not deny the living. The widow walked beside him, boots crunching in rhythm, and he felt grateful beyond words that she had been the one to guide him there. Night came down clean and clear, stars sharp as nails, and as they shared a simple supper by lamplight, Eli sensed that this Christmas marked a turning, not because joy had returned all at once, but because honesty had. He did not know what tomorrow or the season would bring, whether companionship would grow into something deeper or remain a steady friendship forged in winter truth. But he knew this much: the road away from the cross no longer felt like flight. It felt like passage, and guided by a widow who knew loss as well as land, the rancher stepped into the long cold night with a steadier heart. The days that followed Christmas settled into a quiet pattern that felt earned rather than imposed, the kind of routine that lets a man test new footing without announcing it. Eli rose before dawn as always, but the mornings no longer pressed on his chest like a weight. Chores unfolded with their familiar demands and small satisfactions, feed measured, gates checked, breath steaming in the half-light, and often he found Mara already at work on her own place across the draw, a dark figure moving with purpose. Sometimes they met at the fence line to compare notes on weather and stock. Sometimes they worked in companionable silence. The land did not ask them to define what was growing between them. It simply allowed it, and Eli felt a thaw beneath the snow, slow and patient. the kind that feeds roots rather than floods fields. One afternoon, the wind shifted warm from the south, and they rode out together to mend a stretch of fence that had sagged since fall. The work was hard and honest, posts stubborn in frozen ground, wire biting at bare fingers. Yet laughter came easier than expected. The widow teased him about his careful knots. He countered with a remark about her insistence on straight lines, and the sound of it surprised them both, because it carried no echo of guilt, only the pleasure of shared effort. As the sun slid low, they sat on a fallen log and watched the valley take on its blue evening skin. Mara spoke then of the future, in practical terms: calves to watch for, hay to order, the possibility of pooling labor when storms hit. Eli listened and realized how much comfort there was in planning without dread. The past stood behind them like a range of hills, visible and real, but no longer blocking the road ahead. The cross beneath the cottonwood did not vanish from his thoughts, nor did he want it to. Instead, it found its proper place, a marker rather than a magnet. He returned there once more alone, not on a holiday but on an ordinary day, and found the silence different, less accusing, more like witness. He spoke to his wife as he had not before, telling her about the widow who had guided him, about the way winter light caught the snow just so, about the simple hope that had begun to take shape. He did not ask permission, because he understood now that love did not work that way. It did not bind the living to the dead with chains. It set them free to carry what mattered forward. When he rode away, he did not look back, not out of forgetting, but out of trust that the cross would stand whether he watched it or not. As the year turned and winter loosened its grip, the ranch and the widow's spread grew closer in ways both small and significant. Shared meals after long days, borrowed tools returned cleaner than they were loaned, a habit of checking in before storms. The neighbors noticed and nodded. Ranch folk understand alliances forged by necessity and strengthened by respect. There was no rush to name what was happening, and that suited them both, because naming can rush a thing before it has learned its own shape. Instead, they let the land be the measure. If the fences held and the cattle thrived, if the nights felt less empty and the mornings less heavy, that would be answer enough. Spring came tentative and green, and with it a sense of continuity that felt like grace. Calves dropped strong, the creek ran clear, and laughter found its way back into the house without apology. Eli discovered that joy did not erase sorrow. It lived alongside it, making room and taking none away. Mara carried her husband's memory with the same steady honor. Sometimes they spoke of those they had lost, sometimes they did not. Neither felt like betrayal. On one soft evening they stood together on the porch and watched swallows cut the air, and Eli realized that companionship was not a replacement, it was an addition, a widening of the heart that did not require subtraction. When the next Christmas approached, it did so without dread. The decorations came down from the attic early, not as a challenge but as an invitation. Mara helped string lights along the porch rail, their glow warm against the snow, and neighbors gathered again, this time with easier laughter. Children ran and boots stamped, and the kitchen filled with the smell of coffee and spice. At dawn on Christmas morning, Eli saddled his horse, and Mara joined him. They rode to the cottonwood together, not to mourn but to remember. They stood side by side at the cross, heads bowed, gratitude mingling with grief in a way that felt right. The land listened, as it always had, and the wind carried their breath away like a blessing riding back. Eli felt the circle close and open all at once. The promise of Christmas kept not by erasing the past but by redeeming it, by turning loss into a guide rather than a jailer. He looked at the widow beside him, no longer only a guide but a companion, and felt a quiet certainty settle in his bones. Whatever name the future chose to give their bond, it would be rooted in honesty, patience, and the shared knowledge that love, once given, does not disappear. It changes form and finds new ways to be useful. The ranch lay ahead, smoke rising straight in the cold air, fences standing firm against the wide sky. Eli rode with a steadier heart than he had known in years, understanding at last that Christmas was not a single morning bound to a cross. It was a season of return, to memory, to mercy, to the living work of choosing hope, guided once by a widow who knew the way through loss, and now by the land and the love that had grown quietly in its keeping. The rancher went home, carrying the past with care and the future with courage. As the plains stretched open before him, vast and welcoming, just as they always had been,